storytelling really isn't a benign thing. So we need to be really careful about the stories that we're telling and how we're telling stories. So there's a really great book, and this, I just recently taught a class on nonprofit storytelling in the MPA program at Evergreen State College, and this was kind of our primary text. It's called Curated Stories. It's really just a critical analysis of curated storytelling, which is, you know, the stories, a lot of the stories that we hear right now. So stories on, you know, TED Talks, for example, or a lot of the nonprofit storytelling is considered kind of curated storytelling. When we ask people to go talk to their legislators, you know, those are curated stories. They're really short stories that usually follow some kind of narrative arc. And the challenge with these stories, and I think further, is that, you know, we've become a culture that has a very short attention span. So, you know, what used to be, people used to be able to sit through a 5-minute video. Now it's more like 3 minutes or even 2 or 1 minute, you know, before we lose people's attention span. So the challenge with this is that, you know, each individual person has a really complex history, and it's hard to really do an adequate job showing that complexity within a curated story. So a lot of times people are portrayed kind of as individual victims, really pulled out of their context, the context of their community, through the context from like the larger national context, and focused really on that individual person. And then just this idea of sort of a lot of the people who tell their stories really aren't able to improve their conditions all of that much. So a lot of the case studies in this book really shows, you know, she talks about domestic workers, about the dreamers, and the ways in which a lot of the storytelling, you know, people might go and tell their stories to help with policy changes, but when it comes down to it, a lot of the things that people are striving to change doesn't do a whole lot of good for the individual person. So I think it's just, it doesn't mean that we can't tell stories, but I think it's just a caution, and also just thinking about sort of what our responsibility is to the people whose stories we tell, who we invite in to tell their stories for our organizations. So if you're interested in sort of a critical analysis, I would definitely highly recommend this book. So I just want to go through a couple of storytelling terms with you that hopefully are a little helpful in thinking about how stories work. The first is modes. So modes is how we narrate our stories. So there's 3 primary kind of modes of storytelling. There's the personal, which is really stories about our private family life. There's communal storytelling, which is about our community. It's often, you know, multiple. The personal is usually one kind of character. The communal focuses on many people and their interdependence between each other. So a really good example of communal storytelling is Yes Magazine does a really good job of that. And then there's political storytelling, which is kind of more stories about systems. So if you've seen the documentary 13th, which is about the prison industrial complex, that is a really good example of sort of more stories about systems and not people, and that provides just a larger sort of global national historical context. So normally when we tell stories, we're kind of moving between these different modes, but often one mode is dominating. And for nonprofits, we're mostly in this personal, private, family life mode of storytelling, which often, you know, I think the challenge is that we want to connect with donors in our community on a personal level. So we want to hear from individual people. So I think that's why we've kind of sat in that place. It's often the most impactful place to sit for storytelling, but it often can be, there can be the most kind of problems in that realm as well. So the next term I wanted to talk about, which I'm sure you've probably heard before, is tropes. So tropes are common or overused themes or character types. So tropes often sort of reinforce harmful stereotypes or power dynamics. Tropes are really common in storytelling just in general. A really good example is kind of the hardworking immigrant trope, which on face value looks like a positive thing, but it often then suggests that maybe there's somebody who's not hardworking and therefore doesn't deserve the same rights. A common trope in the nonprofit world is kind of the deserving client, I suppose. Somebody who, you know, is really wanting the services, willing to, you know, working hard to change their life. So they sort of deserve to be a part of your service provision. So I think it's just something to be aware of, that we often use tropes when we're storytelling, whether we are aware of it or not. And especially if you're working in kind of the social service realm, there's a danger of sort of something that's called kind of poverty tourism, where we're kind of asking our clients to, you know, share a really personal struggle, and the audience themselves comes from a really different demographic group. So we have to ask ourselves, sort of in our communications materials, are we unintentionally really perpetuating stereotypes about our clients? So there's a really great new resource called Community-Centric Fundraising, and they can help us think through kind of how we're representing the people we're serving. So I can send links to some of these things to Melissa to share with you, but they provide some good tips with that as well. And the final thing kind of term I wanted to talk about was framing. So framing is kind of this process of determining what to include and what to exclude through the use of a variety of devices. So we can think of framing in terms of a camera lens and how much context we want to provide. So we can frame our stories in terms of, you know, a really close-up portrait of for example, an unhoused person in Olympia. We can, you know, get a wider frame and think about an encampment and the relationships and the interconnections between people living in that place. We can think about an even wider frame of homelessness on the West Coast and think about kind of the bigger systemic problems. So it's just important to understand, you know, the choices that you make and how you frame your story really impacts the viewer's understanding of the issue and sort of their relationship to it. So you can ask yourself sort of what type of engagement and response does your framing inspire? So does your framing inspire, for example, you know, somebody to feel empowered and want to get involved in a larger movement? Or does it, you know, inspire a lot of just feelings of like hopelessness and things that are things never going to get any better, you know, in our community? And maybe I'll donate, but I'm kind of exhausted by the whole issue at this point. So you have to kind of think about how you're framing in those terms. And there's a great resource called the Frameworks Institute, and they have amazing resources and tools to think through your framing further. And then there's a lot of different framing devices. So framing devices kind of help us tell our stories. So they include things like visuals, you know, either literal or figurative, metaphors, again, the use of tropes. How do you use numbers in your storytelling to emphasize what you want to emphasize, the impact? How do you express your values around the issue? Music plays a big part of framing. What kind of music you're using and what kind of emotions it elicits as a result. Context, again, is another one. So thinking about, again, the story mode. How much context are you providing in your story? Is it personal? Is it communal? Is it political? Order of events is another device. So thinking about, are you following and I'll talk about this in a minute, a really conventional story arc, you know, or are you telling stories that show the more cyclical nature of history and the issues? And again, who's telling the story? The messengers is another important one. I feel like I saw a hand raised. Did somebody raise their hand? Yeah.
That was me. I'm Diana. I'm the outreach coordinator for Cielo.
Hi.
Hi. So you talk about a really good point in there about the music and what it'll convey. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions as to maybe where's a library of that type of music? I know that in creating stories in the past, the generic tunes that play in your video editors aren't, I mean, for me at least, they don't convey that emotion behind things. So wondering where we could source some of that information or some of that content.
Yeah, well, I at the end of my presentation, I have a link. There's a source that I go to. It's called Premium Beat, and it's just royalty-free music that you can go to, and you can search for a whole variety of different genres of music. So it's just a big variety. So that's one idea.
Awesome.
Another idea is, there's such a wealth of amazing, and this goes to framing again. I mean, thinking about who's invited to help tell your story. So you could think about, who's in your community already, who's a musician, who might be interested in actually composing something, and do you have the funding to pay them a little bit for that? And that invites them in. I mean, then you're like co-creating too. So you're saying like, here's somebody who's already a part of our community who cares about this issue. And music really plays a big role, and they have an interpretation of what this story is about, and their music will convey that. So it's like then you're starting to widen your frame in a way, because you're inviting more people to help tell that story, if that makes sense. So that's another idea.
It is. Thank you.
All right, so then the last sort of storytelling convention I wanted to point out is this basic plot structure. So this is really the common way that we experience stories in our sort of Western culture. And it's the standard sort of narrative arc where, you have your introduction, your exposition, where characters are introduced. You understand the setting, you understand sort of the stakes, motivations. There's some sort of incident that kicks off the story. There's the protagonist is facing an enemy or a conflict of some kind. And then you have your rising action, where there's, struggles and conflicts, blocks along the way. There's usually a turning point where the battle is won or lost, or there's a resolution to the conflict. And then there's falling action, where the characters, you find out what the reactions are as a result. Loose ends are tied up and so forth. And then we have a resolution where there's kind of a new normal that's set in place. So I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's a very basic story structure. And so what the nonprofit sector has done is it's taken that, a lot of the typical kind of fundraising videos follow that same storytelling arc. There's usually some introduction at the very beginning where, you feel connected to the individual person. Then the conflict's introduced. And then about 3/4 of the way through, we hear about the organization. And how the organization has come in and helped that person kind of overcome the conflict. And then there's some sort of resolution where their lives have changed as a result. And so I think what's important here to understand is that a lot of times the organization is kind of presented, and I don't think we're not doing this necessarily intentionally. I think we all have really good intentions, but I think it's often like comes in as the hero that sort of saves the day. So remember, like, thinking about those tropes of victims and heroes and all these character types. So I think often that's how we present, and we want, I mean, in a way, like that's kind of, it's not required of us, but we want to show impact. We want to show the success we're having in our community. But I think it can be sort of dangerous, because it creates this, where the client we're serving seems to have less agency, and that it becomes kind of this almost paternalistic relationship between the organization and the client. Again, totally, I don't think this is an intentional thing. I just think we all want good things to happen in our community, but it's just something to be aware of, that it may not be as productive as we'd like it to be. So what I want to do now is I'm going to kind of move out of here and show you a video. So I'm going to show you a really standard nonprofit storytelling video. And I just want you to take notes as much as you can remember of what I've just kind of conveyed to you over the last several minutes. Just take some notes around tropes, what you remember about the storytelling mode, whether it's personal, communal, political. What do you see as kind of some of the plot points, the conflicts? Think about framing devices. How does the music working for you in this video? What kind of visuals do you see? Who's telling the story? So I want you to just kind of take notes about that, and then we'll come back and kind of talk a little bit about it in a minute. So let me just come out of here, and then I have to share a different screen. Oops. Okay.
When I was pregnant with Jennifer, I was living with my mom. I was 15 years old. I was working with my family on the weekends, and I was still going to high school. I was partying, and I was drinking, and then the drugs came around, and everything progressed. I saw myself losing a job and ended up having to give up my apartment and go into treatment.
When I heard that she was there, I was happy, but yet I was upset because then I was homeless. When I did have a home, I didn't appreciate it. So when it was gone, it was hurtful.
There's really been an explosion of homelessness in New York City in the last few years. We're at the highest level since the Great Depression. There are nearly 60,000 people living in a city shelter every single night.
I went into a homeless shelter with my little one, Juliet.
Since 1967, Project Renewal has served single men and women. We felt that it was important for us to begin to address this added crisis of family homelessness. We started in Casa nearly 2 years ago to house homeless families.
And Casa picked me up and gave me an apartment. I was totally in shock when the case manager over there told me, listen, you got approved and we already got somebody that's looking for an apartment for you. It was an overwhelming feeling of relief.
Lisa was chosen for the program because she was a great interview. She was very open and honest about her substance abuse history, and you could tell she was committed to making a change and making a better life for herself and her children.
My mom had told me that she was getting help by Project Renewal, and that she will be waiting for an apartment. Then I would be able to move in with her.
Walking into the home, it felt like I was free. It felt like freedom. And I could finally have my family together again. Project Renewal has helped us all in many different areas. My case manager, I can talk to her about anything. It's just like I'm an open book with her.
Every client here, including Lisa, has faced homelessness, which is an incredibly traumatic experience. Lisa also struggled with substance abuse history, and she has been able to not only just pull herself up, but really succeed. She now holds down a job. Her oldest daughter that's living with her is also doing an amazing job raising her granddaughter.
I am a full-time student. I'm doing part-time in my internship, and it's getting me steps closer to my ultimate goal, which is to be a restaurant owner. It is great to have a family in one apartment.
They work well as a family unit, and they've really been able to succeed, which is what you want to see in a family program.
I love my mom. She's caring, and she's loving, and she understands every situation.
We're really excited that we're going to begin construction soon on our first permanent housing project that will include apartments for families. We just see that as adding to a rich mosaic, and everybody can support everybody and allow all families to achieve their highest potential.
I'm able to go on vacations. I'm able to provide for my family. I'm able to come home in a straight state of mind and not lose myself out there doing things I have no business doing. And if it wasn't for Project Renewal, I don't know where I would be. It's totally, I don't even know the word for it. It's awesome.
All right. So let me just take a, just give me 1 second. All right, so I think, again, since we're a small group, I won't do the breakout rooms for this, but does anybody want to share some things that came out for them around, you know, framing devices or tropes that you came out for you? Any of the things that we talked about in the last few minutes? Doyle, go ahead.
Turn on the sound here. Well, I mean, I think it's very paternalistic. I mean, this white guy sitting behind a desk, and the poor, you know, person of color who's suffering and, you know, being safe. I mean, all of that felt very uncomfortable for me. I also wasn't very comfortable hearing all of the details of her life. I tend to be a kind of an introverted, shy person. And so people telling really intimate things about their lives is more difficult for me. And I find that a little hard to listen to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great, thank you. Who else for Jessica? Go ahead.
I mean, I thought it was like a good program, but there was a lot of visuals that were distracting. Like, I thought that the way they were, it was great. The presentation, you know, obviously you were trying to keep your mind focused on what they were trying to ask or say. But there was so much visual going on that kind of distracted me from
Okay.
what they were saying, or that for me.
So the visual distractions. Matthew, did you have something? I feel like I saw your hand go up.
Yeah. First, before I share, I'm curious. Do you know how successful this was for them or not?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I should find that out.
I'm just really curious because, you know, personally, so that was filmed in Brooklyn. I'm Puerto Rican. I was like, oh, look, she's making bacalaitos. It was just like, wow, this is sort of everything we're struggling with right now in our country in a nutshell, right here. And you can, and to be really fair, it's filled with the best of intentions. It's filled with the best of intentions, but there was just all, I mean, every trope in the book was there. Like, and literally she said, if it wasn't for X, I don't know where I would be.
Right.
I mean, like, white dude should have been wearing a cape. You know, so it was a little much that way. And at the same time, I can think of, you know, as somebody who lives with one foot in both of those worlds, I could see audiences that would appeal to.
Yeah. And
so depending upon the job and where it's going or whatever, I'd have very conflicted feelings if this was on my website as sort of a general interest thing. If this was for a specific set of donors, I could see it working.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point in thinking about audience and who this is for. To me, when I watched it, I just thought of the very typical, like, Ben Yvonne model fundraising event where you have, you know, room full of donors and you have, you know, this program that has testimonials and one of them's a video and this is shown on a big screen. I mean, that's kind of how I was thinking about it. It's a very like, this is our, I think in some ways, the nonprofit tradition that I think we're moving beyond, I think, in some ways, in our storytelling.
Okay, so that was the question I had with regard to your previous slide then. In terms of the formula, in terms of, you know, establishing sort of a rapport with the individual or the focus of individuals or whatever, and the nonprofit and the mission coming in 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through.
Yeah.
You know, you presented that, but you didn't present your opinion about whether or not that's something we should be following or something we should be exploring breaking up.
I think we should be exploring breaking that up. So I have some ideas of some alternatives, although I have to be honest that I think we're on this point where we're moving beyond that, and we haven't quite, I don't know that we've really quite gotten there. So I think I have some ideas of things to do, but I think the important thing is that we need to maybe break with some of those conventions and move beyond them. So I noticed Diana had a hand, and Doyle, maybe just another minute and then I want to move on. Diana, did you want to go ahead?
No, I think that my hand is probably still raised from the last question.
Oh, okay, I forgot to lower it. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Doyle?
Is it working? I can't tell.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, the screen was kind of frozen there for a second. So I guess that, the question is that there are probably audiences who have expectations based on traditional storytelling.
Right.
And trying to keep that in mind. I mean, as we move forward and try and change our storytelling so that it's more relevant and has fewer of these discriminatory tropes and things, we have to, I think, keep in mind what the expectations of donors are too, and trying to balance that seems to me is going to be kind of tricky.
It is. It's not, I don't think that this is something that's going to change overnight.
Right.
But I think the first thing is just awareness that this is kind of where we've been and working on that. And I think it just takes an ongoing commitment and of education. And I think of challenging our own ideas about what makes a good story. It's challenging. I'm gonna because we're in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on, but we can still come back to some of these ideas. So let's see. So you could think about, we've talked a little bit about the limitations or even the dangers of the story. You could think about, in your free time, you could think about how you might imagine telling the story in a different way. Because I think it's important also to recognize that, just in my own experience of working, doing this I've worked with like production companies doing this and also been the production company doing it. And I think people really want to tell their story. And I think people feel a deep sense of genuine gratitude for the organizations that are supporting them. And I think that people, that I don't want to discredit any of that. But I think, again, it comes down to like who's kind of in control of how that story is being framed. You make all these editorial decisions, including what questions you're asking, what footage you're shooting, how you're editing the story, who you're inviting to be interviewed, all of those things. So basically our tradition has been one that's really focused on an individual, often focusing on their deficits, so addiction, homelessness, for example, in that last story, and their personal story of kind of overcoming that adversity. So like now it's kind of, again, it's like that typical storytelling arc. It's rather than cyclical, it's kind of follows this arc, and then after the program intervention, their life has changed. But, people's lives go up and down, and often focusing on people of color, sharing intimate details of their lives, often to white audiences. So again, thinking about, who is that audience when you're producing things, not taking that for granted. There you do have an audience, and what are their expectations, and how can you work with those expectations to sort of change them a little bit over time. Often frames the organization or the donor as the hero. So this comes from our really contemporary, that's moving beyond, again, this sort of donor-centric fundraising model that I think a lot of us have adopted, where like the donor's at the center, it's about the donor being the hero. So how can we, again, moving beyond that idea? Because often that's leaving out sort of the deeper systemic issues that are the root cause of the problem. So what is really the root cause of the problem of homelessness? So moving away from that individual experience to more of a story about systems. These kinds of stories can reinforce harmful stereotypes or myths about the demographic group of which the storyteller is a part of. That's another danger. And again, unintentional often, but that can be a harm done. And then it relies often on emotions like charity or pity that can lead to sort of donor fatigue. I'm gonna move this out of the way. And like somebody mentioned, reinforces sort of paternalism. So what other kinds of emotions can we elicit and support that are more about kind of collective care, about community empowerment, as opposed to charity and pity?
Before we go on, I think Jessica had a question.
Somebody
I was thinking about, so sometimes when we have, if we're talking about a particular community that we're our audience, those are the people we're trying to elicit support from. Sometimes we can offend them like I probably just might have done at the beginning if someone was listening to how I framed my community, right? So that's another thing, is that you don't want to be offending the very people that you're asking support from. And so we were working on a little bit about this. We're trying to see how we can make our community become the hero of the story. How can we make them feel like they have some skin in the game? How can we make them feel like, so our support, how can you make them be the hero instead of the bad guy, even though that's where these kids are from, right. That's the issue. So anyway, that was my thought.
I think I would just caution you to use the word hero and just think about but I do think you're right about the skin in the game. I think that we all need to feel like we're a part of something that we're collectively working towards, and I don't know that one group or one person needs to be the hero of that story, but I think that we, I think through maybe share underlying shared values, we can get at that. I think, if we can identify what the shared values are between disparate groups within our community, then we can kind of move forward in that way. So I think I would just say that, because I think you're right. It's challenging to figure out how to, you need to get funding from people in your community, so how do you do that in a way? Yeah, it's challenging. So I was gonna, I think I will skip past, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but because we're running short on time, but this is, I think you might be familiar with this photo. It's the migrant mother from the, it's a really famous image that Dorothy Elaine took from the Great Depression. And it just speaks to what we're talking about this idea of, how are people who are receiving services benefiting in the end. So here's a story of this woman who's, become a really famous face of this whole campaign. Dorothy Elaine really benefited from taking this photograph. She got a Guggenheim Fellowship. She sold her images. But in the end, this woman, she really only interacted with her for a really short period of time. She didn't want to release her name to the public for fear of embarrassing her children. It wasn't until later that we find out that her name is Florence Thompson. And but it turns out that she, she's this face of this issue that the country's trying to address. Yet she, still has to work 16-hour days, 7 days a week to just feed her family. And in the end, she doesn't have money to pay hospital bills and really dies without a whole lot of money in the end. Meanwhile, Dorothy Elaine, gets a lot of notoriety from this image. So I think, on a grander scale, it may have had a big impact on our public policies around poverty, but this individual person did not benefit much from participating in this project. So I think it's just important to consider that sort of disparity. Again, it's just all critical thought as we move forward. It doesn't mean we can't do these things. We just need to think carefully about them. There's a good article too that is a link here when I send the PowerPoint that you can read more about it. So what can we do instead? So one of the things you can do is think about moving beyond the personal mode. So try not to tell as many stories necessarily that highlight an individual person, but you could tell more stories that are rooted in a collective we. So like I said, Yes Magazine's really good at that. They actually wrote a whole book of just stories of people across the United States doing really powerful work in their local communities that features multiple people. So you could think about, who, and often this book is about, people who are on different sides of the fence with things, even coming together because they have a shared value. So think about how you can tell a story that includes multiple voices, and even better if they're voices that normally are in conflict with each other, but are coming together around something. So that's one way you can think about it. So you want to emphasize our inherent interdependence, our strengths. So what are we doing really well as a community? How are we coming together? What's our shared purpose? And remembering that we're all benefiting. So if we overcome the challenges that we're trying to address through our organizations, we all benefit from that. So that's one thing that you can do. You can provide context that shifts the focus from the individual problem or the quote victim that's really pulled out of their larger context. So you want to really, I mean, like I said before, educating your donors or lawmakers about the root systemic or historical causes of the problem. So maybe spend more time on that. Maybe having like that be the story with maybe some individuals telling pieces that sort of support that. So coming from almost like the top down in that way. Telling nonlinear stories that show complex, like as much as you can, show the complexity of issues rather than these really simple story arcs. It's really challenging with the way that we need to tell stories these days. You can show that meaning making is ongoing and layered. So again, like moving between the personal, collective, political, as opposed to sort of a singular moment of awareness or following that simple story arc. So the more you can sort of move away from that, the better. And I do think this provides a good example. And Yes Magazine, you can access online too, if you want to see some examples of that kind of storytelling, the sort of collective we with multiple voices. So some ways that we do this is I'm encouraging you to sort of relinquish tight control of the frame. We often don't know that we're controlling a frame. You know, we don't think, oh, I'm going to control this frame of this story, but think about your process. So is it, you know, when you think about, oh, I'm going to create some stories for my organization, like who's involved in that process of thinking that through? Is it just you? Is it your communications team with your ED? Is it the fundraising person on staff? You know, how can you open that up to include, you know, more people who have things at stake, who are being represented? So maybe you invite some clients, you know, maybe you get a group of clients together and some other folks who can think about, you know, what kind of stories you want to tell. So think about, you know, it being more of a group process rather than an individual person doing that work. Understand and embrace the concept of ongoing consent. So this means that your organization does not own anyone else's story. So it's important to recognize that the person whose story is theirs and they can take it back at any time. They have full editorial control of the story. So, you know, as soon as you're done with it, you should make sure you're checking with them to make sure it's some of the way they want to be represented. If they're uncomfortable with it, you need to change it, regardless of how you feel about it, because you don't own the story. And that's true for the whole lifespan of the story, of the use of that. So you might have a video that you've done a year ago, you used it at an event, it's on your website. It's important that you're checking back with people and saying, hey, it's still up on our website. Hey, we're going to use it again at an event. Does that work for you? People's lives change, and they may say, you know, I really don't want that up anymore, or my life has changed, I'm not in a relationship with that person anymore. Whatever it is, it's important. And the way to think about it from my perspective is it's a way for you to continue a relationship with that person. So it's a way to check in with them and just see how things are going. So it's actually, I think it's a positive. And then also think about providing the teller with compensation. So think about, you know, what their time is worth. If you're interviewing them, you're asking them to take some time out of their life, you know, think about if you can provide them with an honorarium for that work. You could also think about pairing stories with conversation. So share a few stories that focus on one or two ideas that connect with your vision. Have less to do with your specific organization. So again, thinking about like, what is this that you're trying to do in the world beyond your organization? And have some focused dialogue about the themes and the issues raised. So you might use a story or two in that way. And then you could also think about investing in cross-disciplinary partnerships to engage and educate. So think about, maybe there's a theater in town that wants to do a theater production that relates to the issue that you're working on. You could think about engaging your organization in larger narrative building work around the issue, so through editorials. So, you know, there's just different ways of thinking about doing this kind of storytelling work. Do a time check, we're getting close to the end. You could also just not use personal stories at all, so it's another option for you. So what this requires, I think all three of these points really focus on education. So I think it's going to be an effort to kind of move beyond this model. I think donors have an expectation of what they're wanting to hear from organizations, you know, this expectation of impact. And I think we just need to continue to educate our donors about the context, about the ideas connected to the work. If you can think about and find ways to help them understand their role and how their life will shift as a result too. So it's not just about taking care of somebody else, but that your life will in fact change if these things will are addressed as well. And it takes kind of this commitment. It's a long-term relationship building commitment. So it's moving away from these like kind of transactional form of fundraising, which is difficult to do, especially with social media fundraising. So yeah, long-term relationships, thinking about breaking down barriers within your community of donor, staff, and client, you know, in ways that are safe and appropriate, clearly. But, you know, if you think about movement building, it's about community coming together and for social change. And I think within organizations, it can be difficult. There's big divides between different parts of your agency. So how can you build a more, I don't know if egalitarian is the right word, but just a more flat organization, less divides between different people that you're serving in ways that are, again, safe and appropriate. So before I move on to that next idea, any questions so far about that? I know I'm kind of just giving you a lot of information really quickly. Diana, or do you have a hand up, or is that from earlier?
I think it just keeps keeping my hand up.
Okay, all right, I'll put it down again. There we go. All right. All right, I'm gonna move on. About 20 minutes. So one idea that's real simple, you know, you can clearly like work with a production company to do some storytelling, but you know, that often costs a lot of money to do. So one thought of doing something that's simple and something you can do on your own, or, you know, ask volunteers to do, is come up with one compelling open-ended question that invites people to engage with your organization's vision or program for which you're trying to raise funds. You can ask a wide variety of people. So again, think about multiple voices, clients, donors, volunteers, staff, to answer the question. And then you can release those stories individually as part of your campaign. So StoryCorps is a really great resource for what makes a great question. Their questions, this is a link to all the different questions they have on their website, and their questions aren't specific for nonprofits, but it just gives you a sense of like what kind of a question you're looking for. And you're looking for questions that make people stop and pause and think deeply about their lives, that are open-ended, not yes or no, clearly. So one idea is kind of a share a moment question. So there's a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is a group that organizes white people to work towards racial justice under the guidance of Black leadership. And, you know, a question you could ask is share a moment when you're sort of called in or not out for a racist remark. So that could be a question. For the Dispute Resolution Center, which is a community mediation center, you could say, share a moment when you're proud of the way you handled conflict. Olympia Film Society, share a moment when you felt most alive at the Capitol Theater. So that's in Olympia, that's our arts, independent arts space. So again, try to create a question that gets people in a thoughtful, expansive, heart-centered place. That also elicits a story. So share a moment's good because it's automatically gets people in the space of thinking about a specific story that they want to share. And again, you know, asking a lot of different types of people. That's just one thought. Another question prompt could be, how would your life change if? So that again gets us in the space of thinking about, you know, all of our lives will change if. So how would your life change if white supremacy was dismantled, which is one question for Showing Up for Racial Justice. How would your working life change if mediation skills were a part of everyone's toolkit, so everybody knew how to manage conflict? How would your life change if artists had access and the funding and support they needed to produce their work? So again, you might not be an artist yourself, but you know, imagine if everybody who was an artist had access and they could just be producing art all the time. That would be pretty amazing. So those are just ideas of sort of those big, broad, open-ended questions that relate to your mission. And then these are kind of what's called the golden questions, you usually use kind of in conflict resolution, actually. But I think they're really useful. what is your biggest concern? And then you could do about whatever the issue is that you're addressing. What do you most want to see happen? What do you most want people to understand? So this last question is an interesting one, and I've often used this at the end of interviews with people, and I've realized that if you start with that question, you could direct the whole interview in that direction after that, because you're really getting at what's most important to that individual person. So those are some other questions to consider. So hopefully your questions will be reinforcing some kind of value or core principle within your organization. So those questions, hopefully, for showing up for racial justice might reinforce their value around calling people out, or calling people in, not out. That's a typo. And Dispute Resolution Center, one of their values or core principles is that conflict is a normal part of life. Olympia Film Society, engaging community through the arts. So how can the question also reinforce some kind of core principle of your organization? So if you're to do this really simple storytelling exercise, you could ask participants to write out their answers and practice reciting them before recording them. So if you want to do a video, maybe the answers would be 250 to 500 words long. You could record them using Zoom, or you could just have them record themselves with someone from their household using a phone and just send you the file. The important thing is to think about, I think especially with social media, I think if there's simple things like this, I don't think you need to worry too much about quality necessarily. I think as long as they're authentic, people know that like they're kind of a do-it-yourselfer type video that you're doing. But it is important to get good sound quality. So StoryCorps has a really good one-page sheet that just gives you some good tips about how to get good audio recording quality. So you could share that PDF with participants. It's really simple things, like if you're using an iPhone, make sure you point the microphone like this to somebody's face, like around 12 inches away or 6 to 12 inches away. If there's a fan going in somebody's room, turn the fan off. Just tips like that to get good audio quality if you're not in a studio recording. You could create a simple video. You could use iMovie, it's free on your Mac. If you don't have a Mac, you could do Film FX, which I actually haven't necessarily tried, but it's a free video editing software. I'm sure you folks might have some ideas. And then here's the link to the music link if you want to find some good music. So you could just essentially have a title screen with a question. You could have your video response that's real short, like a minute long, and then a call to action with your logo at the end and your website. And again, you could use that stock music. You could also find somebody in your community who wants to compose some music for you. You could do the same thing without video, with just an image and text. So, if somebody's writing out their answer, you could just use the written answer and instead have like a still photograph with, pull a quote, like the most compelling quote from the story, and then have like a link that says like read full story or something. And you could have a whole collection of these stories on your website. Maybe you have a whole like tab that says stories. So that's another idea. You could find high quality free images at Upsplash. That's a really good source of really nice images that you can use. I feel like, is there a question? So Diane is asking, yes, we will get a copy of the slide presentation. So we have about 10 minutes. I was gonna have you guys kind of think through some ideas for your own stories. I think I'm gonna just tell you one more quick thing, and then we'll just have some time at the end for some Q&A, and if you wanna brainstorm some things together. But I did wanna just give you a little heads up about accessibility, and this is a whole nother layer of things to be thinking about. But I think it's important just to at least have it on your radar and as a goal to move towards. So accessibility meaning, are you making sure your content is accessible for people with low vision, hearing impaired, that kind of thing. So do your videos have closed captioning? Are there image descriptions? The Community Foundation has a great, if you look at their Facebook posts, it's a great example of image descriptions. Are fonts big enough with contrasting backgrounds? Do you have transcripts available for your video and audio stories? So there's a great organization who I've learned everything that I know about this, which isn't a huge amount, up in Seattle called Rooted in Rights. And they have a whole manual on accessibility, video accessibility. So that's a good place to go if you want to start delving into that. And just take baby steps, you know, I think, as you move forward. But it's a good thing to just have in your radar as a goal to move towards. All right, so I'm going to get out of my PowerPoint. We have about 10 minutes, so I just want to open it up for some questions at the end from folks. Anything around brainstorming story ideas, things that weren't clear to you?
Hi, this is Deanna again. When we were having the conversation around how effective were the videos and the video that we watched, there was a little bit of different feedback from different individuals saying, you know, that one would be a little bit hard for me to hear. So then my question is, do you know of any organization that maybe has done a poll of individuals who are willing to donate, and kind of what do they want to know about the organizations that they'd be willing to donate to kind of give us a little guidance?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Melissa, do you have any sense of that around kind of donor expectations around storytelling? And
I have not heard of anyone who has done any sort of like definitive like research on it. I have seen lots of organizations who have shared that they've done kind of like testing, sort of like trial and errors, like within their own network, such as, you know, creating like a video and then asking a small group of donors who would be willing to, you know, review this, or asking a small number of just like networked people, so like friends, family, those kinds of things, to review it and say, you know, what stood out for them and that kind of stuff. But I have not seen of a large scale results of any kind.
Yeah, me neither. It's a good question.
Okay.
What else? Anything else that's come up for you all? Nothing? Doyle?
Well, I just wanted to say that I thought it was great. I learned a lot, and I thought there's a lot of really good information and a lot of good resources. And I'm with the Arts and Heritage Alliance, and we're working to set up an arts and history museum in Olympia. And you know, one of our goals is to unite the community through sharing art and history and culture. So there's a lot of things that you shared here that I think are really valuable to us as we're kind of just getting started. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thought it was great. And I'm going to pass the PowerPoint on to our board. I'm on the board, but to the other board members. I think Tom Henderson's also on today, and he's our chair. And make sure that everybody gets a chance to see it, because I think it was really helpful. So thanks very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback.
Hi, Doyle. This again, sorry, Deanna again. I feel like I keep coming up. Deanna. I think that I partner with not just Yellow, who's a cultural, a Latino cultural organization, but I partner a lot with a lot of different Latino cultural organizations. Do you mind if I reach out to you and get started in a conversation on how we can partner to help you kind of launch that cultural side of the center?
We would love it.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I will message you with my contact information.
Do you know Griselda?
I don't think I do, no.
Oh, I thought Griselda's really worked a lot with Yale. Anyway, I don't know how to do that. I don't have a Facebook page. You can go to oliaha.org and contact me through there.
Okay.
And Melissa, I wonder if you could set those two up, Doyle and Diana.
Oh, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Woo! Yeah, I mean, great.
Yeah, I can just send an email with both of you in on it. So
perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Great. Anyone else wants to help us? We're open. We want to invite the entire community.
Well, it's good. It's a good model, you know, especially when thinking about community stories, who's at the table. Yeah.
Yeah.
Matthew, did you have something?
Yeah, I just, this is for Doyle and for Jessica as well. You mentioned a couple of things. This training was perfect because I've spent, we're a music organization. We're primarily known for our choirs, but also not just our concert choirs, but memory care choirs and grief choirs, and none of those things are happening right now.
Yeah.
So I've had a lot of time to really think about the next level of things that we wanted to do, but also this project that's been on the back burner for a while, which was to take all of my dissertation research and really figure out how to tell that in a storytelling form, which is the foundation of our organization. And so my research is about what happens in communities extraculturally when you have more arts in a community. What happens to schools, what happens to voting, what happens to healthcare costs, what happens to all of that. And we have the first versions of those stories. So you both mentioned, which again is what we're always struggling with, is not necessarily putting a value on the arts, but bridging that conversation in terms of this is why we should invest in it. So you'll be able to find more and more on my website now about that. And please feel free to reach out about any, I have a huge library of 4 decades of research of other countries that have like, oh, when we put choirs in here, or when we put a watercolor, you know, class in here, this is what happened to prison overhead costs or labor statistics or whatever. So that was it.
Hey, thank you. I'm going to put, so Arts and Heritage Alliance, what's your website, Doyle? Can you unmute yourself?
Forgot I was muted. It's OLYAHA, oliaha.org.
Great. Matthew, what's your website?
Did we have anybody who wants to put their information about their organization in here with their email address?
Sounds great.
Okay.
That would be perfect.
I just put it in the chat.
Yeah, sounds great. Great.
So yeah, if there's anything I can do to help you build your case, let me know. That's where I've been living these days.
Yeah, and anyone who wants to kind of share their information, like either their website or their email contact, if you want to go ahead and put it into the chat here, I can just put it and send it in that email that's going to come out either tomorrow or early next week with this recording as well as the PowerPoint slides. So I can just include it in that email.
Yeah. Melissa, I don't have it. I'm not chatting, so just mark me down as a yes.
Yeah, okay, no worries, not a problem.
Great. Well, I just want to encourage you. I love talking with people about this stuff, you know, and I particularly like to support people with technical issues because I hate dealing with technical issues myself. And so if you're running into something, want to, you know, you get your hand with something, feel free to just get in touch with me. Here's my email. I'm happy to just kind of provide some guidance. Or if you want to run an idea by me or a storytelling idea, I'm happy to spend a few minutes with you. So feel free.
Writing that email now.
Yeah. Technical is, always the worst. Okay. Well, thank you. This has been fun for me. So Melissa, is there anything else you need to touch on to close out?
No, I don't think, I mean, if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to get a hold of me. Most of you should have my email by now, as that's how you got this information to attend the workshop. But yeah, feel free to contact me with any questions you have. And also if you need information on how to get a hold of Elaine, feel free to let me know. And I just want to say thank you, Elaine. This was a great session. I think we had a really good turnout. There was a lot of useful information. And hopefully, are you going to be joining us next week as well, or is it just going to be Danielle?
I'll be more in the background.
Okay.
He's more of the media person, but I'll be there, so I can.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. And does anyone else have any more questions before we close out the session?
Great. All right.
All right. Well, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and I'll see you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
I messed up the writing on here. Let me try it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries.
Melissa, is there anything you want to chat about afterwards, or should I just end the session?
Yeah, nope. I think, well, let's let Thomas put in information into the chat box really quick.
Okay.
There it is. That's right.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciated it. And it looks like